Hello, and a very warm welcome to my History, Health and Wellbeing channel. Today, I'm joined once again by the author of over 10 books on ancient history and climate scientist Ralph Ellis. Hello, Ralph.
Good to be back with you again, Paul. Yes. Hope
Brilliant.
everything's well your end.
Certainly is. And today, we're going to discuss the family or the relatives of Jesus. And I think we'll start with the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. So, what can you tell us, historically speaking, about the mother of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, just starting with Mary, because it sort of demonstrates how many confused names there are in this narrative. And that's why we need to pass and maybe conflate some of these people, because there seem to be far too many of them to be real people. They must be multiplications of the same person, the same name sort of used again and again. And a classic example of this is Mary, the mother of Jesus. What does Adam Clarke say? So, I mean, this has been known about for centuries, of course, that there's a confusion of names here, because, half the people at the cross were all called Mary. I think there was about 4 of them or something. But anyway, Adam Clarke says of Mary, so this is talking about Mary, the mother of James. So Mary, the mother of James, was the Mary, she was the mother of James the Lesser, who was the son of Alphaeus or Cleopas. And she was the sister to the Holy Virgin Mary. Thus it appears that there were 4 remarkable Marys mentioned in the Gospels. There was, and they were all at the crucifixion, of course. There was Mary the Virgin, the wife of Joseph. There was Mary Salome, who was the sister of Mary. There was Mary Magdalene, who came from Magdala, possibly, and Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Although Baronius asserts, and Lightfoot the same, is of the same opinion, that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, were one and the same person. And of course they were. Even you go into Chartres Cathedral, if you have a look at the windows in Chartres, it amalgamates them both. So Mary, who lived at the house of Bethany, one of the Bethany sisters, that was Mary Magdalene. And so we can amalgamate those 2 Marys. So we're cutting the numbers down a little bit. So there was only one in the next generation, Mary Magdalene, and she was one of the Bethany sisters. She lived at the house of Simon in Bethany. But what about Mary the Virgin? So as we've just read, Mary the Virgin had a sister called Mary. Well, that seems unlikely, doesn't it?
Mary 1 and Mary 2, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we've got 2 daughters. Well, we'll just confuse everybody by calling them both Mary. And both of them had children called, let me get this right, called James and my little notes have disappeared here. Anyway, so both of them had children with the same name. I think it was James and Joseph. So both of them, so if we look at Mary, the mother of James, she had a son called James and Joseph. And of course, Mary, the Virgin, the mother, also had sons called James and Joseph. So we have two sisters who had children that had the same name. Unlikely. And they all happened to be at the cross, of course, at the same time. And so I'm not the first person to have proposed this, that Mary, the wife of Alpheus or Cleopas, is Mary the Virgin, Mary the Mother. Yeah, okay, but if that's so, we've got rid of the problem of the multiple Marys. So there was only one Mary, but now she is married to someone who is called Joseph Alpheus Cleopas. Okay, so we've got three names. But of course, if we're using titles, it's probably quite possible. I mean, Alpheus, it says the name is supposed to be from meaning to change, but of course, Alpha is the first letter of the alphabet. Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. It's likely that it's linked to that as a name more than anything else. So we end up with the father of Jesus being called Joseph Alpheus Cleopas. He's got three names, but he's got more than that, because we can go back into the problem we get is, if the Edessa story is correct, then the father of the Jesus character, so Jesus would have been King Esus Manu VI of Edessa. And from history, we know that his father's name was Abgarus. And so why does Abgarus get mentioned in the biblical text as Josephus Alpheus Cleopas? Well, the first reason for that is that the name Abgarus was taboo. It was not allowed to be mentioned. And we've been through this before, where Josephus covers up the name of Abgarus and never mentions it. Neither does he mention Edessa once in his books. The only time we get a mention of Abgarus is that surreptitious mention of him within Acts of the Apostles, where he's called Agabus, which is a play on words of Abgarus. But other than that, the name doesn't appear in the gospel story. He's called Joseph. So why would anyone call Abgarus Joseph? Okay, so we got the problem that you're not allowed to mention his real name. And also, he became, these characters became Jewish proselytes. So they converted to Judaism. We know this from the Talmud, that says that Queen Helena became a Nazarene Jew. And we know this from the Council of Jerusalem, which we'll go through in a minute, where we have 5 different accounts of the Council of Jerusalem, which was all about converting the Edessan monarchy to Judaism. And we'll see why that's true in a little minute. So we have these accounts that the Edessan monarchy did convert to Judaism. And of course, on conversion to Judaism, you would take a Jewish name. Just as when you're born into Christianity, you get a Christian name. And we all have Christian names, and we just take that as granted. Well, you do the same in Judaism as well. You have a Judaic name. And it's not just a random name that's given to you. This will be a name that will be pertinent to you, your position, your location where you come from, or something of that nature. And so what sort of name would they choose for King Abgarus? Well, it's likely that they would choose the name Joseph, as in Joseph from the Old Testament, him of the coat of many colors, because they are very similar. And obviously it would be pertinent to call yourself after someone who led a similar life back in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament Joseph prophesied a famine in Egypt, and then he gave famine relief money in order to save the people of Egypt. Well, King Abgarus did exactly the same in Edessa. It was the Edessan royal family of Abgarus and Queen Helena who prophesied a famine. We have that from Acts of the Apostles. In Acts of the Apostles, 11:28, we have Agabus who stands up and signified by the Spirit that there would be a great famine throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. So he predicted a famine in exactly the same fashion as the Old Testament Joseph. And then according to Josephus, they sent famine relief money down to Judea to save the region from famine. And so Abgarus and Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph, did exactly the same thing. So if you're going to name yourself, by a Judaic name, what better name than Joseph? And I think that's probably why he's mentioned as Joseph throughout the New Testament. And then we come on to, what does the word Joseph mean for the Old Testament Joseph? Because that's interesting as well, because this places this story back into Egypt, of course, which many people resist. And if you look it up in the concordance, Joseph means Yahweh has added, which I suppose it could do in the Egyptian as well, because if you look it up in the Egyptian dictionary, Yosef could mean Yahweh has multiplied. So in the Egyptian, Seth means to multiply, as in multiplication tables. But it has another meaning as well. And that other meaning is son of, or child of. And so Joseph would be the son of Yo. But who is Yo? Well, in Egyptian, Yo or Yah is the moon god. So the name for Joseph, the biblical Joseph, is son of the moon, son of Yah, the moon god in Egypt, which is a sort of standard name that you would get in Egypt. Everyone was the son of one god or another. So Yosef, the son of the moon, would be a perfectly logical name. But if we look up this in the works of Manetho, the 3rd century BC historian, Egyptian historian, he gives us another name. And so does the Old Testament. So we're getting multiple names yet again. And I know some people don't like multiple names, like, bedroom barman says you can't have 2 names for the same person. But Joseph has a minimum of 3 names here. So in the works of Manetho, he's called Petaseph. And in the Old Testament, he's called Zapnath Paneah. That's his proper name. That's his Egyptian name, was Zapnath Paneah. Or if you go to the works of Josephus, he's called Sotham Panish. That's his Egyptian name again. And now you've got to work out what these names mean. Okay, so let's go for the first one then. Let's go to Petaseph. Now, when we're translating names and looking for a meaning back into Egyptian, we cannot just scan through the dictionary and find a similar sounding name and say, oh, well, that's what it means. Because you could virtually end up with anything. You have to end up with a translation that sort of makes sense in the context of that person or that region or whatever. And so what does Petasef mean? Well, as far as I know, it's never been translated because I've never found a translation in any of the reference books I've looked at. So what you're going to see and hear here is all new. Well, I say new because I wrote about this 25 years ago, but I don't think many people have picked up on this, what this name actually means. And the clue to what it means is that Manetho says that Moses was called Ososeph. And he says of this, he says of Moses, he says his name Ososeph came from Osiris, who was the god of Heliopolis. But when he was gone over to these people, the Israelites, his name was changed and he was called Moses. So that's from Against Appian 26. So from Manetho, we know that Osar-Seth means something to do with Osiris. Osar is Osiris, of course, the god, the standard god Osiris, from Osiris and Isis. And so if we're translating this name, we need to know what the Seth means. Osar-Seth. So if we go into the Egyptian dictionary, we find that Seth means son of, the son, the child. And so Osar-Seth means the son of Osiris, which again is a standard name you'll get in Egypt because they're all the son of one god or another. So that makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to the name for Joseph, because he was known as Petasef. Well, if Seth means son of, which we've already found, so Peta has got to be Ptah, the son of Ptah. And the interesting thing about that, if people are not familiar with all of the gods of Egypt, is that Ptah was the architect of heaven and earth. He was the chief architect. Ptah was the god of architects and sculptors and workers in metal, blacksmiths, all of that sort of business. He was the original mason, you might say. And of course, if you look into the New Testament, what was Joseph? We're talking about the New Testament Joseph now. Well, he was said to be a carpenter. But of course, he wasn't called a carpenter. He was called a tekton, both father and son. So Joseph and Jesus were supposed to be both carpenters. But they were actually called they were called tektons, not carpenters. And tekton doesn't really mean carpenter. It actually means mason or architect. So it means the same as Ptah, because he was the god of architects and stonemasons. And so it's quite obvious why they chose this name Joseph. It's obvious that this is linked to this guy called Joseph because they were both chief architects. They were both carpenters. So the name in the Egyptian for Joseph was Petasef, the son of Ptah, the son of the mason, or even Freemason, you could say, the son of the architect of heaven and earth. And so, yeah, it makes perfect sense that he would have been called a carpenter. He would have been called a mason.
Sorry to interrupt, Ralph, but wasn't Jesus's twin brother, St. Thomas, also described as a tekton, a carpenter?
I'm not sure if he was. Yes, he was. In the Gospel of Thomas, he was. Yes, when he went across on his trip to India, he was described as the carpenter, who was the he was acting as a slave to a master. And I can't remember who the name of the master was, but yes, they passed him off as being a chief architect, didn't they? When he went on that boat and set off to India. And then he passed himself off as an architect to the king of India and promised to build him a palace and a castle that was the greatest ever. And of course, he was building a kingdom in heaven, not a real castle on earth. It's a funny tale, that one, the Gospel of Thomas. But yeah, he was being passed off, yes, as an architect as well. So he would have been he would have been a Petaseph as well, the son of Ptah.
Just another question as well. If the family of Jesus were royalty, they were kings and queens, etc. Would they have had a trade? Would they have been architects or stonemasons, or wouldn't they have just been kings and queens?
I think this is more a reference to the speculative architect rather than the operative architect. Although, being the chief architect, because they had many sons, of course, a lot of these families. Well, you look at King Solomon was supposed to have had 900 wives or whatever. They would have had sons in the dozens, maybe even hundreds. And a lot of them had to be given jobs. And so a lot of them had what you might call the technical trades, because an architect in those days would be supremely important, because how many people in the world at that time would understand how you could design buildings so they don't fall down, understanding pi and Pythagoras and all of these mathematical concepts and formulae in order to design a building. It was quite a valuable trade to have that you might give to a prince. However, it might also refer to a speculative architect, which is a Freemason. Because in the Greek, a tekton can refer to a Freemason as much as it does to a Mason. And that's why I said that Jesus was probably a Freemason, because the raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of John is a third-degree Masonic third-degree raising. It's exactly the same as you would go through nowadays, where you are raised from the dead in the third degree. And so Jesus would have been there for a master mason or a grand master of the Judean lodge. And being a prince or a king, he would have been the grand master, no doubt. And so Petaseph with Ptah might also refer to Freemasonry. So, and that's probably why Peter had his name as well. So the primary disciple of Jesus was known as Simon. His name was Simon, but he was given the title of Peter Kephas. And Peter means the stonemason. And it's quite possible that via the Greek, Ptah has become Peter. Because Peter means stone, and Ptah was the god of stonemasons. It's quite possible that that is flowed through the Greek into the English, and so Peter is actually a reference to the god Ptah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, those things do happen. I mean, it doesn't happen on every occasion, but these words do flow through the millennia. A lot of them because of the Bible, of course. We've had the Bible in Europe, for 1,500 years at the very least, and those names that are in the biblical story flow through into the English, and so we've gathered a lot of Aramaic names, and of course Aramaic is a daughter language of Egyptian, so therefore we've gained a whole load of Egyptian names into the English language as well. So I think Peter probably comes from Ptah. So anyone who's called Peter, you're probably the son of Ptah.
Where does the name Akbar come from, or Abgarus?
That one again is not explained. some of the explanations you get in classical reference books are absolutely mad. One of them came up with a name meaning a large skin cyst. I think, why would you call yourself after a boil? You know, here comes King Boyle. No, I don't think that's where his name comes from.
Could it be a title? Could it be a title?
Rather I think it is. Ab is the father. So that's used quite a lot in titles in Aramaic. But then the father of what? Well, I thought that Garus, the most common usage of it, is of an exile. And that might sound odd, but the classical title for a king in Judaism is the exilarch, the king of the exiles. Oh. So when we had all of these Jews over in Babylon after the Babylonian exile, they were in exile, but they chose a king amongst themselves. So, you know, whatever was happening in Judea, they didn't really care about that. They had their own king over in Iraq, modern Iraq, and they called him the exilarch because he was the king of the exiles. And so Abgarus might be the father of the exiles. It would be the same as calling him the exilarch, which is the title they still use today. The last exilarch of Iraq, because Iraq was substantially sort of Jewish up until 1947, when all of the Jews were kicked out. There was something like 500,000 or something Jews were kicked out of Iraq in 1947. And the chief exilarch was Naim Dangur, was the king of Iraq. He was a Jewish king of Iraq. And but he was kicked out in the 1960s along with all of the other Jews. And so he relocated to London. And he still had, I think he's dead now. I don't think he can still be alive. He had a claim in the 1990s for $26 billion of lost assets, which he lost when he was kicked out of Iraq. And it was never paid, of course. He never got a penny from it. You know, that's a history of Iraq that we are never really taught about. No. That the Jews sort of ran Iraq up until 1947. And as soon as Israel was founded, then they were all exiled over the next decade. They were all exiled out of Iraq. Forcibly exiled. So, yeah. So that could be the name for Abgarus. It might mean the exilarch, the king of the exiles.
Yeah, very interesting. Who was Jesus Ben Pantera?
Yeah, Ben Pantera. Well, before we go on to him, perhaps we can just finish the name of Joseph.
Yeah, sure.
Because he has two other names. So in the Old Testament, he's called Zapnath Paneah. And in Josephus, because Josephus has his own version of the Old Testament, he's called Sotham Panich, which is the same name, obviously. Zapnath, Sotham, Paneah, Panich. It's obviously two renditions of the same name, but what does it mean? Which is the better pronunciation for a start? Who got it right? Was it Josephus or the Old Testament? On this occasion, I have the impression that the Old Testament has a better rendition than Josephus does, because it means something in the Old Testament version, whereas it doesn't really in the Josephan version. So Zapnath, I think if we repronounce that slightly and put an S on the front instead of a Z, I think that becomes Safnath. and we've already seen in the previous names we've just looked at for Joseph that Seth means son of. It means the child. It means the boy, the son of. So that would make sense. It's the same sort of translation of we've just used. So Seth, Nath, the son of Nath. And who is Nath? Well, if we're back in Egypt here and we're looking for the god names of Egypt, it's quite obvious that Nath is Neith, the goddess Neith. So Sephneth is the son of Neith. And Neith is interesting because she was the wife of Ptah. So we're going back to the same name again. So Petaseth and Zapnath are virtually the same name. The son of Ptah, the son of his wife, Neith. They're both the son of the architects because she, like Ptah, she was the great creator goddess. She was the goddess who created the universe and all it contains. So she was the architect of the universe, which is the Masonic God. The Masonic God is the architect of the universe. The only difference here is that normally the architect of the universe is supposed to be male, but on this occasion, she is female. So the great god of Freemasons is actually a woman. It's Neith, the wife of Ptah. So that fits perfectly well because it's the same name that Manetho gives. So these come from two different books, remember. Son of Neith comes from the Old Testament. The son of Ptah comes from Manetho. So in two entirely different traditions, and they're giving pretty much the same name, which gives confidence that that is a correct translation because it has a proper meaning that makes sense. It makes sense in Egyptian terms, and it also is the same name between two different traditions. So that's what I think it was talking about. But we still end up with the last bit of this, which is Pania, Panich in the Josephus version. So what does Panich mean, or Panik? Because I think it in the Aramaic it has more of a hard K on the end and not a soft C. So it's Panik. Well, if you look up Panik in the Egyptian dictionary, it actually means my protector, my savior. And that it has great meaning within Egyptian. Egyptian names loved names like this, that you were being protected by the gods or something of this nature. And so the full name, Zapnath Panik, would actually mean the son of Neith, my protector, which has real meaning within the Egyptian. Yeah. That's a sort of classic sort of name that you would probably get. And so that is the original name, the Egyptian name of Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph. And as I say, it's connected with architects and carpenters, and therefore it's a good name. If you're having to rename King Abgarus when he moved into Assyria and when he became a Nazarene Jew, what would you name him? Well, that would be a perfect name. The son of Neith, the son of Ptah, my savior, my protector. Yeah, I think that's his name.
Absolutely fascinating, brilliant. Before we move on to the brothers and sisters of Jesus, we just briefly clear up the Jesus Ben Pantera. Is it?
Yeah. So Jesus has many names, and again, people don't like this, but they are many names for this character within the many books that mention him. So it doesn't matter how many times bedroom barman wants to jump up and down at foam at the mouth at too many names for the Jesus character. He had many names. We know that. And that's not my deduction. That's the deduction of the many theologians that have come before me. I mean, most of these are sort of mentioned by Adam Clarke from the 19th century. He was going through all these many names 130, 40 years ago. And within the Talmud, we get several. We get Ben Stada is one of his names. And then we get Ben Pantera. And we get Bar Kamsa as well, is another of his names. But anyway, Ben Pantera has been translated. I mean, this goes back to Blavatsky. So when she's back in the 1920s, isn't she? Blavatsky was saying that son of, it means the son, well, Ben Pantera means the son of a panther. And there was a legionnaire who was found in somewhere in the Levant who was called Ben Pantera. And so they made this link, of course, between the between Jesus and being the son of this legionnaire, that somehow this legionnaire had a tryst with the Mary the Virgin and produced the Jesus character, and therefore he was Ben Pantera. There's not a lot of evidence that that is correct. I rather prefer the explanation by Ahmed Osman. And again, this comes back from the early 1990s in his Stranger in the Valley of the Kings, I think it was called, his book, which was a very good book, actually. It goes through Joseph being Yuya. So there's another name for Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph. He said that Joseph was Yuya, who was the patriarch of the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And I think he demonstrated that quite well. And so, yeah, Joseph could have been Yuya, and that might be another reason why he was called Joseph, because the names do match between the Egyptian and the Aramaic. And so if we're saying that he was also the son of Ptah, I will have to do a deeper dive and see whether Yuya was linked in any fashion to Ptah. He wouldn't have been when he was at Amarna, because they all changed across to the Aten god. And so that name would have to be deleted. Like it was for Akhenaten, of course. His name wasn't Akhenaten. His name was Amenhotep IV. But when he changed his religion and went down to Amarna, he had to change his name to honor his new god. And so he called himself Akhenaten. So the possibility exists that Yuya was connected maybe perhaps to Ptah before, and then obviously he would have changed his name when he went and joined Akhenaten with his new expedition down in Amarna. Yeah, that deserves some more research, actually. That would be quite interesting. So, yeah, if anyone's interested out there, have a look. See if you can find any links between Yuya and Tuyu, I think his wife was called, or Thuyu was the wife of Yuya. See if they're linked in any way to Ptah or Neith. That might be interesting.
Definitely.
But yeah, so just very quickly to finish off that, what was I saying about Pantera? Ahmed Osman said that Pantera, because this name is given in the Talmud again, so this comes out of the Talmud. The Talmud has a lot of Egyptian sort of content within it as well. So he said Pantera means Pa-Natara, which means my God Ra. So that would be a standard sort of Egyptian title again. My
mm.
god Ra, Pa Neter. Neter means god in Egyptian. And Ra is Ra, the sun god. Neter is the flag, the god flag, which, as an aside, is interesting. In Egyptian, the hieroglyph for God is a flag, which was called Neter. Now, some people have translated that Neter as coming into the English as nature, but I'm not sure that's true because there's not very much evidence for that.
Very
But
interesting.
nevertheless, if you have a flag, that is a symbol of the God figure. And so all of the temples of Egypt had flagpoles along the front. In fact, I wish they would put them back up again because it's so obvious and relatively cheap to do. And it would make them much more realistic as to how they were when they were first built. So every temple had 4, and some of them had 6, but most of them had 4 little niches at the front for enormous great flagpoles, which were higher than the pylon itself, with flags on the top. Unfortunately, we don't know what the symbology was on the flag. That would be interesting as well, but we don't know. We've never found a flag. And that was the symbol of God. And the symbol of God would be, flapping away above the temple with the symbol of the God on it. That was Neter. It was a flag. But when this religion moved across into the Mediterranean basin, they seem to have interpreted this flag as an axe. Maybe because they were more martial or something, I don't know. But if you go across to the Minoans, they had the god axe. But I'm pretty sure when you look at the hieroglyph in Egypt, I'm sure it's not an axe. It doesn't look like an axe. It looks like a flag. But in the Minoan culture, it was an axe, but it wasn't an operative axe. I mean, it was very, very symbolic. It was far too thin to ever be used as an axe. It was a symbol, and that was their god symbol, was an axe. And then, of course, when you go across to Rome, so we're going, through the centuries, through the millennia, and we're ending up in Rome. And Rome had the fasces, from which we get the term fascist. And the fasces was an axe. So we've got the same god axe again as from the Minoan civilization, surrounded by a bundle of sticks. And that is the standard fasces that you will see all across the Roman Empire and in America. So America was founded upon Roman principles of government. That's why you have the House, and then you have the Senate, the same as you did in Rome.
Sorry, Ralph, but I've always been confused as to why you see the symbol of fascism. I think it's in the Houses of Senate in America. It's one of the two. Yeah, and I've never understood that.
Oh no,
it's obviously conspiracies are abound because of that.
Yes. Well, it's not really a conspiracy because it was a symbol of authority. It was a symbol of power. This was the power that you had as a senator, perhaps, or even as an army commander, if you were the chief of the army, that you would hold the fasces. And if you held the fasces, that was your symbol of power. And people would understand that you were in charge. And it was a literal axe surrounded by a bundle of sticks, and that was your symbol of power. And you'll see it if you go to London and have a look at the statue of George Washington in London. He is leaning on a fasces. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial, and Lincoln is sitting on that big chair, all carved in stone, on the front of the chair are 2 fasces. Because the fasces is a symbol of power. And of course, that has been corrupted in our language, that because people like Mr. Big H from Germany in 1939 used excessive amounts of power, he was known as being fascist. But I mean, that doesn't really mean much. It just means he was abusing his power. He had too much power, because the fasces is a symbol of power. And it's not right wing either, because remember, the greatest fascists we've had in the 20th century were Stalin, Pol Pot,
Mussolini.
Mao. They were all left-wing fascists. Just as in America today, the biggest fascist in America today is Antifa, which is ironic because the name of that little grouping is called anti-fascist, but they are the biggest fascists in America at this time, because what they don't realize is by closing down free speech and demanding you all follow the one philosophy, that is the definition of fascism. And people don't realize also that the big H character from 1939 Germany was a socialist. He wasn't right wing at all. I think we've mentioned this before.
We have, although he was battling the communists, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but there's a difference between communism and socialism, of course. Yeah, he was battling against communists, but he himself was a socialist.
Well,
It's in the name.
some people say that socialism is just communism in a suit, don't they?
Yeah, that's a very good description, actually. Yeah, it's in the name of his party. It was the National Socialist Party, and he also had socialist ideals. So they had the socialist road system, the autobahns. They had the socialist car of the people, the Volkswagen, which we have now, of course. It's the car of the people. It was the socialist car. They had the socialist holiday camp, which was Prora, which was the biggest holiday camp in the world, which was the holiday camp of the workers. You were given free holidays by the state at Prora. And he had the socialist cruise liner. So if you were a good boy amongst the workers, you got a free tour on this cruise liner, which was the Wilhelm Gustav, I think it was called. This was pure socialism. It was the party of the workers, not a communist party, but just the socialist party of the workers. And that's not really, if anyone's talking about World War II, that's never really mentioned that they were all socialists. A bit like the British Labour Party is very much the same.
Well, surely the clue is in the name. What was the name? The
National Socialist Workers' Party.
Yes, there's a fairly big clue there.
Yes, it's quite a large clue. Yes, absolutely, indeed.
I know we're digressing massively now, but in the future, I'd love to record the show on World War II with you. I don't know how much you've studied it. I've only just started, but it's there are so many. There's so many stories upon stories upon stories within that story.
Yes.
If you like, it's a fascinating part of history.
It is. Yeah. It's a. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, the more one learns about it, the more one realizes how little we've been told about it, and the actual truth of what actually went on and why things happened. It's yeah, but again,
Yes.
if we ever did that, we'd have to probably bit shoot it or put it on Odyssey.
You probably would. Yeah.
Yeah, which would be, it's a big shame, but there we go.
Yeah.
Sorry,
the main takeaway. Yeah, we don't want to get sidetracked too much on that, but the main takeaway from all of the history that's been coming out from the Second World War is that nothing is as it seems at face value. So, you're given a narrative about World War II, which I was given, when I was young and so on. And then you find that all of these different things happened and that not everybody agreed. So, you're led to believe that there was bad on one side and there was good on the other. But there was an awful lot of people stuck in between the two who didn't really follow one side or the other. and were trying to sue for peace, even though that the other guy was bad, but peace is better than war and all of that sort of stuff. So there was an awful lot of politics going on, and it wasn't just a simple us and them. There was so many people stuck in the middle as well. It's an interesting development, and it's also an era when anything goes. So modern politics is very restrained. It has to be, because it has to, fit within the cultural norms. But during wartime, of course, all of that goes out the window, and virtually anything goes, and anything did go as well. So that was interesting.
Most interesting.
Going back to the subject, we've got two topics here which we can go through. We can go through the Council of Jerusalem, which is connected to Joseph and the conversion, or we can have a look at the brothers and sisters of Jesus first.
So, Ralph, shall we move on to the Council of Jerusalem and Josephus's conversion to Judaism?
Yeah, because that's an interesting topic, which gives us confidence that what the New Testament is saying is actually grounded in history. Let's go through that. Oh, very quickly before I start, just the reason why the fasces is a symbol of power is because of the axe that's sitting in the top of it. So the axe in the fasces is a symbol of God. So it's power through God, because that's the God, that's Neter, it's the Egyptian God symbol. And it's surrounded by rods, because those rods represented the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, if I can say it properly. So there should normally be 12 rods around the axe. So it's not simply power, it's the power of God through the Judaic God and through the Israelites. And yet that's the power symbol that they had in Rome. And that is also the power symbol they have in America. It's the power of the Judaic God, which gives the fasces the power. Interesting, isn't it? It all goes back. It goes back to the Old Testament. And people have forgotten that, so they don't even know what fascist means anymore. But there we go. We were going to move on to the Council of Jerusalem. What is the Council of Jerusalem? I think we've touched on this before, but
I think it came up in our Unterbrink debate video.
Yes, that's right. But I've got a lot more information on that, which makes it more interesting, because it appears in 5 different places. And so, what was it in the first place? Well, the Council of Jerusalem was in biblical terms, it was a meeting trying to convert the people of Antioch into Judaism. And so we had these people, apostles, running backwards and forwards from Jerusalem up to Antioch to convert the people there into Judaism. And then there was a discussion as to whether they can become simple Judaists, or whether they had to go the hardline route and get circumcised. So there was a big discussion about circumcision. So we get this in, as I say, nearly 5, I think it is, different places. And we get it in Acts of the Apostles. So Acts 15, the whole of chapter 15, virtually, I think, is all about this. And we have people, I might as well just read some of it. It says certain men came from Judea up to Antioch and said, if you're not circumcised like Moses, you cannot be saved. So Paul and Barnabas had a big dissension with them and a dispute with them, because obviously Paul and Barnabas were saying that you don't need to have circumcision. This question might be about castration, actually, rather than circumcision, but in Acts of the Apostles, they're really talking about, they're talking about circumcision. And so there was a big contention of this. Do you need to be circumcised in order to become a proselyte Jew. And so they all go off to Jerusalem to have a word with James, the brother of Jesus, and ask them whether you need circumcision or not. And this was the Council of Jerusalem. So they had this big council where they all discussed this. And eventually it was decided that no, James didn't back the hardline route. You could become a proselyte Jew without circumcision. And so he just gave Saul the 4 rules of simple Judaism, which became Christianity. And those 4 rules were: don't eat meat offered to idols, don't drink blood, don't eat animals that have been strangled, and don't engage in fornication. And by fornication, they tend to mean incest. And that was the 4 rules, and that was it. And he says, fare ye well, off you go. Marvelous. So the whole of Leviticus and the whole of Deuteronomy goes out the window, all of Mosaic law, and you end up with 4 very simple rules for the proselyte Gentiles to become associate Jews, you might say, because they're not real Jews, of course, but they're following simple Judaism, which, as I say, became Christianity. That's why Christianity follows Judaism, but is not Judaic. So that was the Council of Jerusalem, and that's from the Gospel story. But then we have the same story in Antiquities, so the works of Josephus. And so Josephus gives the same story, but he's talking about Adiabene. But remember that Adiabene is Edessa, because the queen of Adiabene was the queen of Edessa. So we're still talking about Edessa here. And remember that Edessa was called Antioch. So when Acts of the Apostles is talking about Antioch, is it talking about Antioch or is it talking about Antioch Edessa? I think it's talking about Antioch Edessa. So this is all a story about Edessa. And it's saying that when Isates, which is King Esus, was at Charax-Spasni, so he was away from Edessa. He was somewhere else. I think he was probably in Alexandria. I'm not quite sure, but anyway. So the king was away from the land. And a Jewish merchant, an apostle, called Ananias, got among the royal women and taught them to worship the Judaic God. And he persuaded Isates, presumably when he returned, I suppose, to embrace Judaism. And about this time, Queen Helena, who was the queen of Edessa, was instructed by a certain other Jew and went over to them. And we know that from the Talmud. The Talmud says that Queen Helena converted to Nazarene Judaism, not any old Judaism, but Nazarene Judaism, the same Judaism that Jesus belonged to. When he saw that his mother was highly pleased with Jewish customs, he made haste to embrace them entirely, and thought he could not be a proper Jew unless he was circumcised. But Helena endeavored to stop him. This is the contention between, do we circumcise or not? And it might have been a discussion about do we castrate or not. But anyway, bear that in mind. She said to him that this thing would bring him into danger among his subjects, that they would never bear to be ruled by a Jew. So the king at these times complied with these persuasions of Ananias, but afterwards another Jew came out of Galilee whose name was Eleazar, and he persuaded him to do this thing, i.e. to get circumcised or to get castrated. But essentially, this is the same story as we're getting in Acts of the Apostles. This is about a conversion of the people of Antioch. But you see, this is where the Acts of the Apostles covers things up, so you don't exactly know what it's talking about. It's not talking about the people, it's talking about the royal family, because they're the people you want to influence. You don't care about Joe Bloggs down the corner who runs the hot dog stand. you care about the royal family because they will influence the rest of the people. And the Antioch is not Antioch on the coast. So these people who go around furtively looking around the coast of the Mediterranean for Edessa are, yes, completely wrong. They're talking about Antioch Edessa, which was beyond the Euphrates. They're talking about Edessa. So there are two illustrations of this same Council of Jerusalem. But we also, without going into too much detail, we get the same story in Moses of Corine, the Syriac historian, and the Doctrine of Addai. We get the same story. And we get virtually the same people. So the works by Josephus says that the moderate apostle was called Ananias. In the Doctrine of Addai, he's called Hanan. And in Moses of Corine, he's called Anan. Quite obviously, Anan is Ananias, and Hanan is Ananias with the standard prefix of H, which they always use in Greek. Aramaic does the same as well, if I remember. They always put the an H prefix on. It means the, basically. So there's four for a start, all talking about the same story. And then in History of the Holy Grail, in Arthurian legend, we get the same story again. So we get these people shuttling backwards and forwards from Jerusalem, sort of Jerusalem, up towards the maimed king, or the wounded king they call him, because the king had been wounded between the thighs. Quite obviously, the maimed king is something to do with castration again, or perhaps circumcision. That's why he was wounded between the thighs. And he's afraid because his lands become a wasteland, which is exactly what Queen Helena said to the king of Edessa. Don't do this because your lands might become a wasteland. You may lose your lands that you rule over. It's the same story. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 copies of the same story in 5 different books, all talking about the conversion of the Edessan monarchy to Judaism. And that is the time, of course, going back to the name for Joseph that we've just been talking about, that is the very time, of course, that King Abgarus would have to have chosen a Jewish name. And he did, and the name they chose was Joseph, because of all the reasons we've just been through, because Joseph did very much the same thing. He prophesied a famine and gave famine relief money to, in this case, Jerusalem, exactly the same as the Old Testament Joseph did in Egypt. And remember, if you're reading Acts of the, not Acts of the Apostles, if you're reading Josephus's Antiquities, the famine relief money is tacked on to the end of this story. So they go through the conversion of the king to Judaism, the possibility of circumcision or castration, whatever it was. And then immediately after that, they go straight into the famine relief money that was sent. It's the same story. And this is when King Akbarus would have taken up his new name, and that new name was Joseph. So it's not very surprising that we get these names, these different names within these books. They could not mention King Akbarus because this story is not supposed to be set in the AD 60s. It's not supposed to be about the Jewish revolt. It's not supposed to be about the monarchy of Edessa. You could not mention them in the gospel type story. That would give the game away. It's just not possible. You would have to have a different name. And what better name than the Old Testament Joseph? I think it's a brilliant pseudonym. It matches him perfectly. And I think that's exactly what they did.
Absolutely fascinating. Just, I'd like to go back to circumcision, Ralph, because there might be some viewers new to this subject that don't really understand why was circumcision so important.
Yes.
Where did it all come from? Where did it start?
Sorry, yes, I was just doing something over here. Yeah, where did it start? Well, it goes back a long way. It goes back to Cybele and Attis. So Cybele was one of the very early Greek gods. I think she goes back to the 6th or 7th century BC. And she was the great mother goddess. In a way, I suppose you might connect her with Neith. We've been talking about Neith as being the creator goddess. I say Cybele. In Greek, I think she was called Kybele, was a better pronunciation of her name. So we'll call her Kybele. Kybele was the great mother goddess, and her consort was Attis. And so Attis was just a minute. He was castrated. He wasn't circumcised. He was castrated. And so he was the original eunuch demigod. He was only a demigod, of course. And so that's where we get the origins of castration from, in the sort of religious sense, because in the practical sense, we might have had eunuchs working for the king for many millennia, of course. If you're going to have people working in the harem, you didn't want intact men working within the harem. And so they would have to be castrated. They would have to become eunuchs. And so in the palace, you might have had eunuchs for thousands of years. And there was a report I think it was in one of the books about Persia I was reading, where the the wives in the harem actually liked the eunuchs more than the king, because apparently when you're a eunuch, you can stay up longer, as you might say. And so yeah, there were goings on within the harem, put it that way. Circumcision itself, rather than castration, was an Egyptian tradition. So we have quite a few drawings and imagery of people being circumcised in Egypt. Not sure why the custom should have started.
People have. Sorry,
yeah.
it's a very strange thing if you consider it.
Some people said it was for cleanliness. There was a report out a few years ago saying that there was a far less chance of getting the AIDS virus if you were circumcised or something. So there might be some health benefits, possibly. But yeah, it seems, quite a strange thing to be doing. Maybe it's a halfway house to castration.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Yeah, and the proper ceremony would be for castration. Now, that sort of might make sense, because I linked up this to... Do I have any pictures? Let's have a look for some pictures. Yeah, so let's go back to Google Chrome. Let's do a screen share. Screen share, there you go. And I want to do a window. So I've traced this very tentatively back to the era of Akhenaten, because the Nazarene we were talking about the connections with the gospel story. Just a minute. We were talking about connections with the gospel story, and Jesus was a Nazarene, of course, and so was Queen Helena. She was a Nazarene. Oh, my mail just crashed for a minute. I was going to give you a quotation. But anyway, they're both of the Nazarene sect. And we have a report about the Nazarene. I'm not sure what's happened to my mail. My quotation was in mail. Let's hope it comes back up again. We have a quotation about the Nazarene from Hippolytus in his Against Heresies. And what he was saying, just briefly, was that the Nazarene venerated the primeval Adam. And of course, it's not explained exactly who the primeval Adam was. I have an idea because I'd already linked Akhenaten with the biblical Adam. So Adam and Eve would have been Akhenaten and Nefertiti living in the Garden of the Eden, and the Garden of the Eden was the Garden of the Aten, which was the garden of Pharaoh Akhenaten. There were so many links between the Genesis story and the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And so it seemed reasonable to link the primeval Adam with Akhenaten. And of course, if we look at Akhenaten, we find that, like the primeval Adam, just to continue that, the primeval Adam was a hermaphrodite. He was neither male nor female. And of course, if we look at Akhenaten, that's exactly what we see. Akhenaten has portrayed himself as being androgynous. He has the wide hips of a woman. He has the small breasts, perhaps, of a woman. But he is a man, we know that, and he has no genitalia. He is the primeval Adam. He is the neither male nor female, androgynous primeval being. And this primeval Adam was supposed to be a demiurge, a creator god. And so not a real god, more like a demigod. And of course, Akhenaten would have been perhaps a demigod. And so I was left wondering if the Nazarene were actually venerating the history of Akhenaten. So yeah, so I link him back to Akhenaten. And if we look at because they were a strange couple, this pair. This is Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And of course, these were the two naked lovebirds in the Garden of Eden. They strolled around naked in Amarna. So this is the queen. This is Queen Nefertiti. And she's actually portrayed, so she got a sculptor. She stood in front of the sculptor and had herself sculpted fully naked. And this is one of the daughters on the right side in porphyry here. A very nice statue of one of the daughters, I think, of Nefertiti. And again, she is pretty much naked, apart from a diaphanous robe, you might call it, where you can see everything through it. How shocking that must have been. I mean, I don't know what classical Egypt was like, but if you can imagine, we have the I don't know, the Queen's birthday or something before the Queen passed away, and she has a big parade in London, or she has a gathering and a meeting at Buckingham Palace, and there she is strolling through Buckingham Palace stark naked. I mean, how shocking would that be? How shocking was this for the people of Egypt, that the Queen of Egypt would be walking naked through the palace and portraying herself naked on her statuary, and her daughters and her husband. This is Akhenaten, was also parading himself through the palaces naked and portraying himself in the temples naked. I mean, these were really a couple of hippies, you know, in
I was just
in
going
their
to say
new,
hippies, yeah, definitely.
yeah, free love, you know, 1960s flower power, you know, flower in her hair, perhaps. Yeah.
Are there any comparisons to be drawn with these two and the Essenes, for example, or the Nazarenes?
Well, I don't know about these people as such. Let me just come out of screen share. If I can remember how to do this.
I've done it. There we are.
Oh, you've done it. Okay.
Yep.
We're back again. Okay.
We are. We're back.
Possibly. I've not seen any comparison directly with Akhenaten, but of course the Essene were the sons of Zadok, and the brother of Jesus was called Zadok. So yeah, we were going to talk about the brothers of Jesus. This is one of those similarities, is that James was the brother of Jesus, and most people, even Adam Clarke, you know, 140 years ago, was saying that he is the real flesh brother of Jesus. And James, I think, was the older brother, but James was known as James the Just, or James Justus, which is interesting because there is a very famous Justus of Tiberias. Now, Jesus probably came from Tiberias. He had been living in Tiberias. If you remember, I link him up with Jesus of Gamala and Jesus of Cephius.
Yep.
Well, both of those characters were the governor of Tiberias. So it wouldn't be surprising that James was also linked to Tiberias. And of course, Justus of Tiberias was a very famous chap who wrote a history of the Israelites and the Jews. So his was the history of the kings of Judea from Moses to Agrippa, I think was the name of his book. Not a very catchy title, but there we go. And that was a real book. And it was read by Photius.
Does it still exist?
No, you see, unfortunately, anything that disagreed with Josephus Flavius got thrown in the bin. So we have no copies of it, which is a real shame because Josephus Flavius hated it because it conflicted with what he had written. So we would dearly love to know why he hated it quite so. Because it would be very, very interesting to see what Justus of Tiberias had written. And I can't bring up the quotation because it won't come up for a minute. My screen with all my notes has disappeared. So I wonder, nope, that's not going to work. So anyway, I might find it later. So we have this book which has gone missing, which gave an account of the Jewish revolt and the kings of Judea in the 1st century, and it's gone missing. We don't have it. And the most we get from it is a 1-paragraph quote from Photius, which says that it's a good history, if I remember correctly this quote, it's a good history of the kings of Judea, and it gives a history of the Jewish revolt, but nowhere in this chronicle does it mention our Lord Jesus. I presume Photius must have been a Christian. So we get this alternative history of Judea in the 1st century, and it doesn't mention Jesus. Odd, isn't it? So, people have jumped on that and said, well, this is evidence that the story is mythical, that the Gospels have been fabricated. But of course, what it might have mentioned is it might have mentioned King Essenes of Edessa, not the biblical Jesus.
Of course,
and
yeah.
So, of course, they wouldn't mention the biblical Jesus, because that name is a fabrication by Josephus and others, because they weren't allowed to mention anything to do with Edessa. So yeah, we await the discovery of the book by Justus of Tiberias, which is probably sitting in the Vatican Library somewhere.
Yeah, just going to say, yeah.
I would, because Photius, when was he? I don't know. He was probably 4th century or something. Anyway, he's in the centuries AD. The book was knocking around at that time, but it went missing. James was called Justus, as we've said. But if you take that in Aramaic, this is why a lot of these people end up with 2 names, or more than 2 names, is because they were working with 2 languages. So Justus would be the Greek, meaning the righteous one, the just one, the same as it does in English. But in Aramaic, the same title was Zadok, from which we get the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the Zadokites.
Okay.
So James was a Zadok, and it means the same, of course. It means justice. It means righteous. But the Essenes, you were talking about the Essenes, they were the sons of Zadok. So does that mean that the Essenes were linked to James? Was he running that little offshoot down there at Qumran on the shores of the Sea of Galilee? It's possible. It's the right sort of era. It's the right sort of intent, because these people were known as Nazarene. And the Nazarene, it means to separate yourself off from the community, which is exactly what Qumran was doing. They were separating themselves off from Judean society because they didn't agree with it. They thought they had the wrong interpretation of Judaism. And so they had their own monastic, as it were, community down on the shores of the Dead Sea. And they were known as the sons of Zadok, the sons of Justus. So was that Justus of Tiberias? It's quite possible, I think. So that James may have been the titular leader of the Qumran society. It's quite possible. And so James is quite obviously a real character. So, for the mythicists who say that this is all a mythical story, James is mentioned by Josephus Flavius, and that seems to be a real description and not an interpolation, much more so than the Testimonium Flavium, which is obviously an interpolation. But the James mention is more realistic, as though it was part of the original story. So
sorry, Ralph, does Josephus refer to James as the brother of Jesus, doesn't he?
He does, yes.
Yeah.
So he sort of knows of Jesus, but Jesus is obviously the minor character and James is the major character. That's quite possible, because in my chronology, James would have been the leader of the church way up until AD 62 or 63, when he was thrown off the steps of the temple and either died or was crippled or whatever, and he was beaten around the head by Saul, which is an interesting story. That's not actually in the text, but it does sort of match it. This comes from the Clementine recognitions, and it has the story of the attack on James, who was thrown down the steps of the temple. And then he was beaten about the head by someone with a fuller's club. And a fuller's club is a club for beating clothes. You know, when you're washing clothes, you use a fuller's club. And the name is not given. But in the margin, a very ancient chronicler has written Saul.
Wow.
But of course, if you read the gospel story in Acts of the Apostles, many people, including Eisenman and various other people, have said that Stephen and the death of Stephen is talking about James, because Stephen just means the crowned one, the prince. And so a lot of people think that the death of Stephen is the death of James. And of course, while that is happening, you get Saul standing by a pile of clothes. Why would that be mentioned? Well, because he's the guy with a fuller's club.
Wow.
Again, it matches.
That's amazing. I didn't know that at all. Wow. That's incredible.
So it's likely that Saul was the guy who was beating James around the head. So
which
James,
of course, is Josephus Flavius.
Who's Josephus Flavius, yeah. And Josephus Flavius became, not at this time, I don't think, depending on when this happened, but became the army commander in command of Galilee. So he wasn't just an author, you know, sitting behind his desk. He was an army commander as well. So it wouldn't be so surprising that he was beating people around the head. I do wish I had this quote from Photius. The other thing Photius said about Justus of Tiberias is that he was in contention with Josephus Flavius. So he was contending with, having arguments with, but contending in a sort of militaristic fashion with Josephus Flavius. Now that's interesting, because that's exactly what Josephus Flavius says, except he doesn't say it about Justus of Tiberias so much. He actually says it about Jesus of Gamala Cephius. So the guy that Josephus Flavius was contending with in Galilee was actually Jesus of Gamala, the biblical Jesus, which is why initially in my first book I said that Justus of Tiberias might be Jesus, because there is one verse, I think, in the Gospels which calls Jesus Justus. It's one of his titles. So I thought that might be a reference to Jesus, but it doesn't really suit him very well. It suits much better if Justus of Tiberias was actually his brother, James, because he was much more regularly called James Justus, James the Zadok.
Just out of interest, Ralph, where is Tiberias located, or where was it located?
On the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
So it's on the west banks of the Sea of Galilee. It's actually on the shore. It's a very nice town, actually, if you want to go there. Very nice town, very sort of cosmopolitan now. It was quite small in Roman times. And that's where the Hamat Tavira Zodiac is as well. It's in Tiberias, well, just outside, just to the south of it. So, you can see both of them there. So, it's right in Galilee. And it was Jesus of Gamala and Jesus Cephius who were the governors of Tiberias.
Fantastic. So we've covered Jesus's brother James. How should we move on to St. Thomas of Edessa?
Yeah, so that's another of the brothers of Jesus. So just to recap, Jesus had at least 4 brothers. So the brothers are actually named in the Gospels, and they're called James, Jude, Joseph, and Simon, and plus 2 sisters.
And sorry, is that Simon Peter? Sorry, I'm getting quite excited here. Is that Simon Peter, or is that Simon the Zealot one?
We don't actually know, because it doesn't really tell us. So Yeah, all of my stuff crashing doesn't help. I had this already up here. So the Simon is just said to be the brother of Jesus. They separate him off from the other Simons. So yeah, they're trying desperately not to link him with the brother of Jesus. But yeah, there's no reason why not. I mean, these families always did operate within the family, because I mean, who do you trust? If you want to have disciples helping you in your particular organization, who are you going to choose? Well, the majority of them are going to be your brothers, aren't they? And it just so happens that amongst the disciples, all of the names of the brothers of Jesus are within the names of the disciples. And so it's quite obvious, I think, that this was a family affair. And so it's even possible that Peter was Brother Simon, who gained the title of the Peter, the stone. So yeah, but we were looking at Thomas, weren't we, Brother Thomas?
We were, yeah.
Well, Thomas was Judas, and we do have a Judas, of course, as being the brother of Jesus. So as I said, his brothers were James, Josette or Joses, Simon, and Judas. So it's quite likely that Judas was Judas Thomas, Judas the twin. In fact, he was called Thomas Didymus, because again, we have these two languages problem. So Didymus is the Greek, and Thomas, I think, is the Aramaic, and they both mean the twin. And then the question becomes, well, who was he the twin of? And tradition has it that he was actually the twin brother of Jesus. That is why in the Talmud and in the Quran, that they say that it wasn't Jesus that was crucified, it was just a similitude. It was a lookalike. And therefore the lookalike may well have been Judas Thomas.
It's a very sorry. It's a very sort of random thing on the surface to say that it was a lookalike. That's quite a specific.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that tradition was obviously abroad, because it's in the Gospel of Barnabas as well. So there are various outlets who were trying to put abroad. I mean, maybe they were trying to do this to say, well, Jesus wasn't crucified, he's still alive, but if he came back from the dead, you don't need to say that. So I don't know why they would bother saying this.
I wonder how much Jesus would have had to have paid his lookalike for that job.
Yes. Yeah, so a lot of people at that time thought that it wasn't Jesus that got crucified, it was his brother. Which is possible. We don't have any evidence for or against that, but we do have this guy who's known as the twin, and his name, well, his full name, I'm going to have to apologize to Bedroom Barman again, because the full name of this guy, and this is not me talking, this is Adam Clarke and various other theologians from more than a century ago, and they've identified him as Judas Thomas Didymus Lebbaeus. What's his final name? Lebbaeus and
Didymus?
no, Didymus we've had, Lebbaeus, and there's another name, and also he was called Adai as well. Thaddeus, of course, that was the other name. So Judas Thomas, Didymus, Lebbaeus, Thaddeus were the names of this particular character, and Thaddeus, if you contract it, Thaddeus becomes Adai, which is where we get the doctrine of Adai from, because Adai was always known as Thomas, Judas Thomas. And again, this is different languages. So Alpheus and Thaddeus means strong-hearted, I think it is, the lion, the strong-hearted one, but again in Greek and Aramaic. So we got the two different languages. And that's how you end up with loads and loads of names. And this is the guy that's supposed to have gone to India, like you were saying. So we have this from the Gospel of Thomas, where this one is quite apocryphal. It's a story, it's not a history. So it's not a chronicle, it's a made-up story. However, it does have links with real history. So this is the chronicle that says that Thomas went off as an architect or a carpenter, a designer, to India to go, and they ended up working for this king in India, which is where he promised to build him a palace, and he didn't. He built him a palace in heaven instead. And setting up the church in India. And it so happens, of course, that we do have the Edessan church in India, which is at Kerala in southwest India, which I knew nothing about for a long, long time. And it suddenly popped out of the woodwork. I forget what we were researching. We were researching something. And suddenly came across this book, which is the history of the Church of Malabar, which is down in Kerala in southern India. And do we have a good title page to actually look at? Well, this is the title. Well, there's two title pages here. So this is the history of the Church of Malabar, which was discovered by the Portuguese in 1501. And this book was written in 1694.
Wow.
So this is a reprint, of course. This is not an original. I think probably only the British Museum, British Library has the original. So this is a reprint of the original, and it gives the history of the Church of St. Thomas in Malabar in southern India. And Thomas being the brother of Jesus, and it's explicit that this is Thomas, the brother of Jesus. But the odd thing is, and remember again, we've only discovered this in the past few months, long after I've written my book, that this is it's the Church of Edessa. It's known as the Edessan Church because Thomas came from Edessa. So this comes from the Doctrine of Adai again. And okay, the Doctrine of Adai is supposed to be semi-apocryphal. It's not really a chronicle, but I can see quite a lot of history within that particular text. And it gives the history of Thomas Adai going to Edessa and converting the king of Edessa and curing him and all of that sort of business. And then the Gospel of Thomas talks about Thomas going out to India. So that I've all written about a long time ago. And I've linked it up with Edessa, of course, as being where these people came from. And then we find much later, many years later, we find this church church with a capital C. There are actually 6 churches in Malabar. And we find that this is the Church of Thomas from the Doctrine of Adai. And then we find that this is the Church of Edessa, because it was set up by Thomas, who came from Edessa. But then 200 years, 300 years later, the church was dying because it didn't have enough people in the congregation. And so they sent the bones of Thomas back to Edessa, and another 350 people from Edessa moved to India to join the Church of Edessa there.
Wow.
Probably at that time, because that's when Edessa was taken over by Rome. So Edessa failed, if I remember correctly, in about something like 220 AD, and it was taken over by Rome. And so there would have been a reason for people to move out of Edessa and go to perhaps go to India. So it's known as the Church of Edessa. So we have this double link between Edessa and Thomas, and now the Church of Malabar in India.
I think the last official king of Edessa was Abgar X, Farhad, son of Manu, who reigned between 240 to 242 AD.
Sounds about right. Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, that's when Edessa was taken over. Farhad is a contraction of fratrices, of course, frates. It shows how close that the Edessans were to the Parthians and to the name of frates, because I said that's where they came from, and the original name of Abgar might have been Phraates V. Well, there we've got an Edessan king who's called Phraates. It's a Parthian name that they're still using.
Wow.
So we have this history of the Church of India, and I've just managed to get another book because not much is written. This book here doesn't give much of the original history. It's mainly concerned with the history of the church in 1500 AD when the Portuguese found it. And it doesn't mention the founding of the church very much. So it's not very good from that point of view. But I've just got another couple of books which do go more into the history of the founding of the Malabar Church. So that would be another interesting thing to look at.
Definitely.
And it's interesting how these things confirm what I have already written. Not knowing anything about that church in India, we suddenly find that there is an Edessan church in India that is linked to Thomas, the brother of Jesus. And of course, the brother of Jesus coming from Edessa rather infers that maybe Jesus came from there as well, perhaps,
Definitely.
Who knows?
It's amazing stuff. Have we covered all the brothers? What about sisters? Do we know anything about sisters? Well, we obviously know about Mary Magdalene.
Well, one of them I think was called Salome.
Right.
But no, we don't know anything about the sisters. Adam Clarke talks about this. I mean, just he's saying this. It's saying it is possible that the brothers and sisters of Jesus may mean near relations, as this word is often used amongst the Hebrews. But I confess it does not appear to be likely to me. Why should the children of another family, like a cousin or something of that nature, be brought in here at the crucifixion? Etc., etc. Prejudice apart, would not any person of plain common sense suppose from this account that these were the children of Joseph and Mary, the brothers and sisters of our Lord according to the flesh? It would seem odd that this would be doubted, but through unaccountable prejudice, the Papists and the Protestants are determined to maintain as a doctrine that which on the scriptures is totally silent to them, vis-a-vis the perpetual virginity of our mother, the Lord. So this is why I like Adam Clarke. I mean, here in that little passage, he is being critical of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church as not being broad-minded enough, that surely these are the real brothers and sisters of the Lord, of Jesus. So in terms, I mean, he has his Christian bias, of course. He's a Christian theologian. But in terms of looking at the history of the Gospels, he's probably one of the better theologians you could probably look at. This guy's 19th century, of course. I think he's. Let me quickly look up Adam Clarke, Commentary on the Bible by Adam Clarke. He has a commentary on every verse in the Bible. So this was the life's work, I think you could call this.
Is that still easy to find? Sorry, I was going to say, is that still easy to find now, the book?
It must be on Amazon, surely, I would have thought. But if you buy it as a hardback, I bet it would be very expensive because it must be a huge book. So it's probably best to get it online. I've got an online version. Published in 1832, so it's even older than I thought. Electronic one is copyrighted 1995. So by Sulu Kelly has made an electronic version. So there must be electronic versions around. Well, I've got one.
Brilliant.
So yeah, that's a valuable resource really, because he gives a very good and very detailed commentary on what these verses are meaning. The only thing you have to be aware, of course, is he's taking quite often the Orthodox classical interpretation. But I say he's more open-minded than the Catholics and the Protestants, so that's quite good.
Brilliant. Okay. So are we ready to discuss the children of Jesus, do you think?
Yes, we can. I don't have much information on that because I've sort of forgotten everything that I've written because it was so long ago. Yes. So, okay. So this is one extra portion of that story. There was a mention within the Gospels of Saul meeting with a son of Jesus. And he swears at him and blinds him. Saul does, the son of Jesus. The question then, of course, becomes, is that a real son, of the real Jesus, or is it just, a common name, as they normally say? In the context, I read it as being a real son. Why would Saul have a contention with this guy all of a sudden? And it just read as though this could well have been a real son of Jesus. So yeah, I think we can be fairly sure that Jesus did have children, and we have the story, apocryphal, of course, of Sarah going to the south of France, going to Provence, and landing at Marie de la Mar, which is on the south coast of France in Provence. Very nice place. Delightful place. I've been there about 5 times. I enjoyed it so much. I keep going. I used to live in Spain, and so every time I drove down, I used to drive rather than flying. I used to stop off at...
Sorry, I hear Aix is very nice. It's supposed to be very nice there.
Aix, yeah, Aix is very... I did a big tour of the whole of that region. So I parked myself up in a hotel in Marie-Salamar. Off season, because it's very expensive during the summer, but off season you can get some cheap hotels there, and did a big tour of all of Provence for a whole week. Very, very nice. And there's a big, long tradition that Mary Magdalene and Sarah, I'm just trying to remember because it's so long ago since I've written this. I'm not sure if it was Mary the mother or Mary Magdalene. I think it was Mary Magdalene who was supposed to be in this boat with Sarah. So this would be a daughter of Jesus, and they sailed to Provence and landed at Marie de la Mar, and then moved up to Tarascon and Orange. And she was also supposed to be at Aix, as you say. There's a cave there that's supposed to be dedicated to Mary Magdalene, but there's no real evidence, of course. It's all based on mythology. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's where they went to, because, I mean, that's where Pontius Pilate went to.
Really?
That's where, Yeah, I think he was sent into exile because he wasn't a very good governor. I think he was sent into exile into Provence. And so was Archelaus, I think, Herod Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great, when he made a mess of Judea. I think he was sent to Provence as well.
Wow. Well, in a
So
sense, that adds credence to the story, doesn't it? That Mary Magdalene may have been sent there with her daughter.
it does. I mean, it was sufficiently far away from their previous positions of power that they would
Mm,
no longer be influential, and sufficiently within the realm of Rome that Rome could keep an eye on them. Again, Rome didn't always kill people that it didn't like, because if you just keep killing all of the leaders, whoever is going to be a leader
mm.
within your empire. And so sometimes it was best just to farm people off and put them into, what do they call it, gardening leave.
Yeah, yeah,
If you're in a large company, you get gardening leave,
that's
which
right. Yeah.
means you're an absolute idiot and we want to get rid of you.
Eventually, everyone forgets about you, I suppose.
Yeah, basically.
Mm,
And so that's what happened to them. And I think that's what happened to Mary Magdalene as well.
mm,
She had lost all of her money because she had been, one of the wealthiest women in the whole of the Near East and the whole of the Roman Empire.
mm.
She had lost all of her money, all of her influence, and she was shipped off to southern France. And that's where she ended up. And when she went on this trip, she was accompanied by Sarah. And Sarah means the princess. And so everyone has taken this as being a daughter of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. There was one other potential son of Jesus that I came across, and this comes again from Arthurian legend. And people don't like me talking about Arthurian legend, but Arthurian legend comes out of the Near East. It comes out of the Crusades. And so this is the traditions that they brought back with them from the Crusades about the Near East, about the first century. And they write these complex little stories because you could not mention that they'd come across a real historical chronicle of Jesus when they were there in the Near East. So they had to cover it up. They had to write it in code, rather like the Talmud writes in code as well. And so what we get here is a story about King Everlac. Now, this is a story, and I won't go through the full story because it's too complex to actually give in a short briefing. But they have a king of the East who is known as Everlac. And then later on, we're given the second name for this guy. So he's called Everlac Mordrain. And the position he's in the Near East is between Jerusalem and Babylon, and it just has to be Palmyra. So this guy is the king or the prince of Palmyra, and he's called Everlac Mordrad or Everlac Mordrain. And the question is, who is this guy? And for many reasons, it just seemed very interesting to me that if you insert Mordred into the middle of Everlac, we end up with Evil Merodach, Evil Merodach, as being the full name of this character. And why would they use that strange name? Well, it just so happens that in the Old Testament, we have a king with the same name, and he was called King Evil Merodach. Now, in the real world, he was known as Amel Marduk. So if you go across to Babylon, he was the king of Babylon. He's called Amel Marduk. But in the Old Testament, he's called Evil Merodach, which is the same name that they're using within Arthurian legend. And then the question is, why are they doing this? I mean, this is typical Pesha. It's what the Talmud does all the time. You borrow names from the Old Testament and you give them to the people that you're talking about in the modern era, or in this case, in the 1st century. And you do that for 2 reasons. One reason is that you can use it for prophecy. So whatever the guy did in the Old Testament, then perhaps, history will repeat itself. And so the same may happen again. So you can use it for prophecy. And you can also use it to hide someone's real name. Because you can talk about this guy called Evil Morodak, and no one will know who you're really talking about. And in this case, well, who are we talking about? What did the original Evil Morodak do? Well, he was the next king after Nebuchadnezzar. And it was Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple of Solomon. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, jumping to the 1st century, it just seems very, very likely that this character, Evil Morodak, the one that they're trying to transpose into the 1st century, was the son of the person who destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. You see the Pesha comparison. But who was the guy who destroyed the temple? Well, we know who that is now. Through my works, we have discovered that it was the king of Edessa. The guy who's known within Josephus as Jesus of Gamala, who's known within the Talmud as Bar Kamsa, and who is known within history as King Esus Manu of Edessa, who was the leader of the Jewish revolt. And of course, the Jewish revolt ended up with the destruction of the temple and the... oh, yes, it wasn't just the destruction of the temple. It was also that it sent the Jews onto an exodus, which is exactly what happened with Nebuchadnezzar, of course, because he took all of the Jews away from Jerusalem. It was known as the Babylonian exile. So they all went on an exodus. So in both cases, we have a king who destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took the Jews on an exodus. Both Nebuchadnezzar and the king of Edessa guy. And then the next generation, presumably a son, in both cases are called Evil Morodak. Called that in the Old Testament, according to the Old Testament, about talking about the Babylonian exile, about Nebuchadnezzar. And then within Arthurian legend, we're talking about the son of the guy who destroyed Jerusalem, who in that time would have been the king of Edessa. And it just seemed to me that that was a perfect way of hiding a character from history. You don't have to call him by his real name. You call him by this pseudonym because he did the same thing as the previous Evil Morodak. But this guy was the king or the prince of Palmyra, which is highly likely because this is what the Edessan monarchy did. They would have had many sons, of course, and you don't want all of these sons kicking their heels around the palace like, Charlie Boy was doing in Buckingham Palace for 50 years, getting bored and, making a nuisance of himself, you might say. And so what do you do with these princes? Well, you farm them off to various principalities and you give them a job to do so they get some experience on how to rule. So you'll give them a city or a region that they might rule over under the power of the king, of course, but nevertheless ruling a particular town or whatever it happens to be. And we know that the Edessans did that. And so one of the sons might have been sent out to Palmyra. Another might have gone to Amida. Another might have gone, Amida is Diyarbakir. Another might have gone to Haran, for instance, just south of Edessa. So they were all given somewhere to rule while they were just princes. And so this is direct evidence, I think, that one of the sons of Jesus was a prince governing Palmyra at this time. And the interesting thing is that Josephus says, Arthurian legend says that Josephus, because in Arthurian legend we always get this confusion between Josephus Flavius and Joseph of Arimathea. They are always confusing the two because they secretly know that Joseph of Arimathea is Joseph bar Matthias, Josephus Flavius, and so they deliberately mix them up. But Arthurian legend is saying that Joseph of Arimathea, i.e. Josephus Flavius, was sent after a war, which is obviously the Jewish revolt, was sent to Palmyra to get them to lay down their arms. And this is exactly what you might expect in real history, because the Jewish revolt had ended. Jerusalem had been destroyed. The Jews had all been sent on an exile. The Roman army was still in Judea. But what the Roman army didn't know what was going to happen next is who would join into this revolt. The emotions were running high at that time, you might say. And there were still a number of localities who hadn't necessarily given their true allegiance to Rome. One of those would have been Edessa. Nobody knew quite what Edessa was going to do because Edessa hadn't thrown its full army into this revolt. The King Jesus character had been based in Judea at that time, and he had used local forces down in that region in order to start the Jewish revolt. And it seems clear from the works of Josephus that they were concerned, Josephus was concerned, the Romans were concerned, that the Edessans over in Edessa would send their army down as well. And Josephus alludes to this. Well, more than alludes. He's writing to them, and he says, why would you expect that these people in Edessa would come down to Judea to fight against the Romans when we know the Romans are invincible, etc., etc.? So he's trying to persuade these people not to join in the revolt. And as far as we know, Edessa, although it was nominally ruled by King Jesus, did not send its army down to fight against the Romans. So basically, there was a bit of a revolt amongst the aristocracy within Edessa who didn't agree with the king and didn't send the full army down. So that's one place that the Romans were afraid of. Commagene is another place. Just to the northwest of Edessa, there was another kingdom, and I think it's pronounced as Commagene. And they didn't send their army against Rome. They, in fact, sent forces in order to help Rome. But after the revolt finished, Rome was still uncertain about their intentions. And they sent an army up there to disarm them, basically, because they didn't want them stirring up a revolt. And the other one, of course, was Palmyra. What was Palmyra going to do? They had a powerful, or could arrange for a powerful army. What were they going to do? And so, according to Arthurian legend, and I think this is more history than legend, they sent Josephus Flavius there in order to disarm them, or at the very least to find out their intentions. And so he went across to Palmyra and gave them the options that they had to convert to simple Judaism and disarm. And poor old Josephus, well, I can't say poor old because he's a disgusting fellow, so he deserved everything he got, basically. Josephus had to go there, not knowing what their reaction would be, and asking them if they would convert to simple Judaism. And he gives this rambling speech. This is one of the reasons we know this is something to do with Josephus Flavius. Only Josephus Flavius could write this screed of nonsense about simple Judaism that he gives in his speech to the Palmyrans, saying that they should convert to this religion. And initially, of course, they say, "You're raving mad," which is probably correct. But finally, he sort of gets them to agree, because there was a standoff. When people are reading the Gospels, they don't read it in political terms, but it has to be viewed in the politics of the region at that time, the power politics of the two empires. So Palmyra and Edessa were sandwiched between Parthia and Rome. So Rome was not simply concerned about Palmyra, which is sort of east of Damascus, put it that way, out in the desert, and Edessa, which is across the Euphrates, as we've said, in Mesopotamia. It wasn't simply worried about those little towns. If it had just been that little town, of course, Rome could have piled in with its entire army and just destroyed Palmyra in 5 minutes. What they were concerned about is that the Parthians had their army sitting out towards the east because they were worried about what on earth Rome was going to do. They had had the Jewish revolt in Judea, so 3 legions had piled into Judea to quell the Jewish revolt. That means that Rome was arming its eastern borders with Parthia. Parthia doesn't know what's going on. Perhaps the Romans are just going to continue moving eastward into Parthia. And so the Parthians would have had their army standing by just in case the Romans want to move any further east. So if Rome goes into Palmyra and destroys Palmyra, well, that's almost right on the borders of Parthia. Parthia is not going to accept that. So Rome couldn't pile into Parthia and just destroy it. So the political route out of that mess is to send Josephus Flavius over there to advise them to disarm, because we've got 2 legions sitting in Damascus if you don't. And so the poor old Palmyrans are sort of umming and ahhing about this, not wanting to convert to, because Rome wanted to get rid of Messianic Nazarene Judaism, and no doubt any son of Jesus would have been a Nazarene, and therefore of the militant wing of Judaism, a Nazarene. And so the idea was, if you convert these people to simple Judaism, the Judaism of Saul Josephus, then you could neuter them and neuter Nazarene Judaism. And that's why they sent Josephus Flavius in there instead. And he appears to be successful in the end, but only because Rome had 2 legions sitting in Damascus. And of course, if you read this, it doesn't read like that. You have to sort of vaguely read between the lines somewhat, because Josephus is saying, oh, God will punish you. God is on my side, if you don't do this, don't do that, all the rest of it. Well, yeah, but what sort of God? He's probably referring to Vespasian and Titus, which were his own. No, it doesn't say God, it says my Lord. Well, who's my Lord? Yeah, it's Vespasian and Titus, more than the heavenly God above. So it's probably talking about the legions of Rome being there, ready to invade if they don't disarm.
Mm.
So yeah, it's an interesting little aside in Arthurian legend that, I mean, it's talking about the 1st century because it's involving Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius in this story.
Mm.
It's overtly talking about the 1st century
Mm.
and 1st century politics. And secondly, it looks like from what it's talking about fits the political situation at that time. So it may well be historically true, which is what I like about these little snippets of information that drop out of Arthurian legend. They may be based on real history.
Mm.
So, and that would have been a son of Jesus. So a son of Jesus was the prince of Palmyra. They hadn't got involved in the Jewish revolt, probably because they thought that Rome was invincible and therefore you're not going to win. And so Jesus didn't even get the backing of his son, which is interesting if this is true. But such things happen, you know. Families do fracture. I mean, just look at Ginge and Cringe in America. Ginge being Harry and the Cringe being Megan. Families fracture.
You've only got to read about, I don't know, 30 or 40 pages of Josephus to see like all these families killing each other, basically. It's worse than an episode of EastEnders. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, look at the whole of the First World War. The First World War was the British royal family against the British royal family. Because all of the people competing in the First World War were cousins of Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
Cousins and nephews and God knows what.
And you had one banker, I think it was Mark Wahlberg, financing one side, and you had his brother Paul financing the other side.
Yep, that happens as well. But
yeah, absolutely.
virtually all of the monarchies in Europe by the time of the First World War were all related to Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
And yet they still ended up in the enormous great battle together. Yeah, it does happen. You know, people don't always agree just because they're part of the same family.
The King Everlac story is written about in a lot more detail than we've just gone into in this book, Ralph's opus, the Grail Cipher.
Yeah, the Grail Cipher.
As you can see, it's about 600 and odd pages long. So, but I'll be reading that again in the near future.
Yeah, interesting story.
It's fascinating. I wanted to just bring a couple of things to your attention that I found while you were talking. Firstly, I found this. Here we go. Can you see that?
The blinding of Jesus.
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah, I thought that might be it.
Yeah, so that is it. So it's Acts 13:6.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so that's worth having a look at. Anyone who's watching.
Do you want to read that out for?
Yeah, sure, I'll read it out. Yeah. Okay, so Barnabas and Saul arrive at Paphos. They are challenged by a sorcerer and a false prophet named Bar Jesus or Bar Joshua. Bar Jesus was a counselor for Sergius Paulus, the Roman proconsul on Cyprus. Thus, Bar Jesus was a very powerful man in the government. His name means son of the Saviour, but he is also known as Elimas, meaning wise in Arabic. Sergius Paulus wishes to meet with Saul, but Bar Jesus opposes this meeting. Paul is described as full of the Spirit as he condemns Bar Jesus. Paul accuses him of trickery and deceit and perverting the ways of the Lord. Paul then blinds the man and he has to be led away. This is in itself a rather unique event in the New Testament, but the miracle is also a symbolic act. There are a number of miracles in the New Testament which are more or less prophetic acts. Jesus heals a blind man in Mark 8:22-26, who begins to see, then sees fully. This is a picture of the understanding of the disciples at that point in the Gospel of Mark. The result is that the gentile man, who is not a God-fearer, believed and was amazed at the teaching about the Lord. So that's the first bit.
It's interesting, isn't it? So if we actually go to Acts of the Apostles, so the guy is called Bar Jesus, or Elimas, of course,
Yes.
which is translates directly as a wise man, and Saul gets upset with him, of course, because he doesn't agree with him. And what does he say? He says, I'm just reading it here. He says, the hand of the Lord is upon thee, and you will be blind and not seeing the sun for a whole season. And immediately there fell on him a mist and a darkness, and he went about seeking some to lead him by the hand. So Saul blinds this guy for a whole season because he didn't agree with him. So here we have Saul Josephus, who's having an argument with a wise man that he disagrees with, who was called Bar Jesus, the son of Jesus. Now, who did Saul disagree with? Well, Saul at that time was having disagreements with the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James. That was the big contention. It was between the Nazarene Church of Jesus and the new, what I call simple Judaic church of Saul. They were almost at each other's throats. So Saul is contending with someone who must be linked with, I would say, the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James. And the name of the name of this person is Bar Jesus, the son of Jesus. So who's this going to be apart from a real son of Jesus? But if you look at Adam Clarke, and this is where, of course, Adam Clarke falls down because he's a Christian and he cannot entertain anything of that nature. But he has to give a commentary because he he gives a commentary on every verse. And so he says, Bar Jesus, that is the son of Jesus, just as Bar Jonah is the son of Jonah. Yeah, we know what Bar means, but he won't even entertain to hazard a guess as to who he was the son of. Which Jesus? Come on, tell us which Jesus.
I'm a bit surprised that made it past the censors, when the Bible was compiled. That's quite surprising.
Yeah, these books, when you read them, even the works of Josephus, they were not written by one person. They were written by multiple scribes. And that's why we get so many duplications and so many chronological errors, because you've got all of these scribes working semi-independently, and information comes in to a particular scribe, and he doesn't quite know where to put it in this big manuscript that they're sort of trying to put together. And he doesn't know what the other guy, on the desk next door has done on the previous week. And so he just inserts it somewhere into this evolving manuscript. And so you get different interpretations by different scribes put in different places within these manuscripts. And this was obviously one that slipped through the net. And it's got to be a son of Jesus, isn't it? It
Sure,
really has.
Yeah, really, yeah. Okay, last thing, Ralph. I'm just going to try and share one more thing here. Can you see that?
Let me try and make it a bit bigger.
Well, basically, it's a king's list, the Abgarus dynasty.
Oh, yes.
And so we have, I've gone a bit too far into history there. Hold on one moment. There we go. That's better. So we have Manu the Sixth, son of Akbar, 57 to 71 AD.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Abgar the Seventh, son of Manu, 71 to 91 AD. So
Yes.
would that be King Everlac?
Yes, if he was crowned, we don't know if he was ever crowned king of Edessa. Of course, he would be a son of Jesus, King Jesus, but he would have had several sons, and we don't know which one was crowned next. But the interesting thing is they had to crown a new king in AD 71. Why was that? Well, because the previous king had gone missing. Now, we normally think that, you know, this only happens on the death of the previous king. But that's not necessarily so, of course. It can also happen if your king gets put into prison somewhere and is never going to come back. And it was pretty obvious from the Roman reports that this king was never going to come back home again. He had been thrown away into a deep dungeon. Well, actually, more like house arrest, actually. It wasn't a deep dungeon, but as far away from Judea as they could possibly get him, so that he was never going to have any influence over Edessa again. And so he wasn't coming home. And so they needed to crown a new king. And that's exactly what they did, because the Jewish revolt ended in AD 70, and they crowned a new king in AD 71. Again, it's evidence that these monarchs, the kings of Edessa, were involved in the Jewish revolt, the leaders of the Jewish revolt. And yes, we don't know which son became the next king. I mean, we have a name there. What was the next king? Was he
Well, we have Abgar the Seventh, son of Manu, 71 to 91 AD.
Abgar the Seventh.
Then, interestingly, we have an 18-year period of I can't say that word. Interregnum.
Yes, interregnum. Yeah.
Interregnum. Thank you.
Interruption in the reign list. Interregnum.
Right. Okay.
So when was that? Was that before or after?
That was 91 to 109 AD, after Akbar the Seventh.
Yes. Wouldn't be so surprised, because that was the end of Domitian's reign, wasn't it? And things were very uncertain at that point. Lots of finger pointing. Yeah, I'd have to look into that, but I wouldn't be surprised that there would be a gap in the king list at that stage.
I should apologise to viewers here, because I've been referring to him as Abgar the Seventh, but it was actually Abgar the Sixth who reigned between 71 to 91 AD. Then we had after that interregnum, we had Abgar the Seventh, son of Ezad.
Yes. Which again shows the true pronunciation. It's the son of Ezad, not Izates, which was his full name. Now they're calling him Ezad. And of course, that again links Adiabeni with Edessa, because Ezad was an Adiabeni name, which is supposed to be this place over in Mosul, which I keep saying doesn't exist. And everyone keeps saying, oh, no, it does exist, even if we can't find any archaeological evidence for it. And they had these kings called Izates and Ezad. But here, the Edessan king is called Bar Ezad, yeah?
Yeah, just go back to that just to check. Abgar the Seventh, son of Ezad, it says.
Son of Ezad, which is an Adiabeni name, which again very strongly suggests that Adiabeni was actually Edessa. And also, of course, in the AD 50s, the queen of Edessa was the queen of Adiabeni. It was the same queen, Queen Helena. Queen Helena was married to King Abgar V of Edessa. So, yeah, I don't think Adiabeni existed. I think it was just a pseudonym for Edessa.
Or was it just something that Josephus invented rather than...
He probably did invent that name. I mean, people keep saying that we have mention of this name beforehand, but the mentions of this name are scanty and not always correct. There was a mention by Strabo, but when you go and actually look at it, he doesn't actually mention Adiabeni. He mentions a similar name, not quite Adiabeni. We had a mention by Octavian, I think it was, in his funerary inscription, which mentioned it. But when you read the inscription, it was talking about Armenia, not Arbela. So even if that was a mention of this place, it was mentioning a different region. It was mentioning the king of Armenia. And of course, Armenia was closely allied to Edessa because they were right next door to each other. Armenia is just north of Edessa. And Armenia kept records. You know, we can only go on these places that kept good records. I mean, I would love to have the chronicle of Hatra. Hatra was another city-state down by Edessa, down by Mosul, down by what was supposed to be Adiabeni. We don't have their chronicle, but we do have chronicles from Armenia. But what Armenians keep doing is they keep using other kings and saying, oh, they were the king of Armenia. They were really our king. So quite often they will use a king of Parthia and say, well, that was the king of Armenia. Well, he probably was, but Armenia was just a province. They were mainly the king of Parthia. But maybe Parthia at that time had extended their influence and taken control of Armenia. So they just say, oh, well, that was our king. He was a king of Armenia. Well, they do the same with Edessa. And they say that King Abgarus was a king of Armenia. Well, I suppose he might have been if he had so much influence that he had taken over Armenia as well at that time. And so you get this real confusion between these different provinces, who was actually king and who wasn't. And, you know, people like Bedroom Barman keeps mixing up these people and saying that they were the kings of Armenia when they were actually the kings of Parthia instead, because they hold the generic title for the Parthian kings. So, yeah, you have to be very careful when reading these texts because the history is very confusing at times.
Poor old Jacob.
Some say, but most of us don't.
One last question for you. We were talking about the political machinations in and around the area of Judea around the time of the revolt. Do you know about the Essenes royalty and their position on the Jewish revolt? Where were they?
The Essenes did not join in with the revolt. So a number of these kings actually sent auxiliary forces to help Vespasian against King Esus Manu down in Judea. And as far as I'm aware, the Essenes did not join in the revolt, and they actually helped out Rome. They might have been slightly duplicitous. I mean, it's like Agrippa II. So Agrippa II was the nominal king of Judea in Israel at this stage, and he was a staunch supporter of Judaism. But nevertheless, he was still supporting the Romans. And so he was walking this very, very, very narrow tightrope between the Jewish rebels and Rome, because he was, although he was classically Judaic, he wasn't revolutionary Judaic with the Nazarene. And this is always the problem with what is essentially a civil war. You know, in a civil war, who do you support? And Jesus himself sums up this absolutely perfectly when he says, I come not to send peace, but I come to send a sword. I am here to send father against his brother, and mother against his daughter, and your enemies will be in your own household. That's a perfect description of a civil war. You can split even down on family lines, because it depends who you want to support, where, which direction you think is best for that nation and that country and your people. There was a classic letter that I saw during the English Civil War. So this is the war with between the Catholics and the Protestants back in the 17th century in England, with Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, as being on the parliamentarian side. And there was a parliamentarian writing to his brother and saying, "Dear brother, I love you dearly, but I cannot understand why you are supporting the royalists. And I have to inform you that if I see you on the field of battle, I will be forced to kill you." And it's a real poignant letter describing the realities of a civil war, that these were two brothers on opposite sides of this particular dispute between Catholicism, basically, and the Protestant church. And yeah, it divides families, just as Jesus said.
Yeah. Okay, so we're approaching the 3-hour mark now, Ralph. So we probably best stop there.
I think so.
I've really enjoyed today again. It's been really fascinating, and I'm going now to have a lie down and a read of this book.
Oh, that sounds like a good idea. Get out the Grail cipher.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that it's complex political history. That's the difference between the normal gospel story and what has been teased out of these texts. It's not a simple story as is given in the Gospels. It's complex, it's political, it's involving huge empires and powers beyond the reach of Judea and that simple conflict here. So it's a much more complex story than the gospel story makes out.
Yep. A great summarization. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. We'll be back in the very near future with another video. Thanks for watching. Cheers, Ralph.
Thank you. Bye-bye.